All right, so it is 1:40 now, and I'd love to jump in here. You can hear in the background the bells are ringing. I am still in school right now, but that bell also means that it's 1:40, so we can jump into today's topic of this breakout session. Thank you, folks, for coming. I encourage you to keep that chat open and active. I'd love to have a conversation with folks. What we're going to jump into is the AP Computer Science principles and how that works, how that aligns with New York State's new computer science and digital fluency standards. So let's begin. So first off, my name is David Chakowski. I am at FDR High School in Hyde Park, New York. If you're unfamiliar with where that is in New York State, I'm pretty much halfway in between Albany and New York City, and depending on where you call New York City's boundary, in the beautiful Hudson River Valley. In fact, my district overlooks the Hudson River. We have the Roosevelt Estate in our district, which is where our name came from. Franklin D. Roosevelt's homestead is here, and it's a beautiful house overlooking the beautiful Hudson River. My email address is here. I would love to follow up with you if you have more questions about what we're going to be talking about today. If you're curious about AP Computer Science principles, or maybe you are a teacher yourself of AP CSP, and you have some feedback on the crosswalk, the evaluation we're going to look at, or I should say the alignment. I'll get it into the variation there in terminology. So I'm curious, who's in the room? Who's coming to see an alignment of APCSP with the state standards? If you would please share in the chat, who are you? What's your role in implementing these standards? And what is your actual direct interest in aligning CSP with the state standards? So if you could in the chat, who's in the room? Hi, Jessica. Wonderful to see you. And we got a small group here. This is great. So from the voices that I'm hearing in the chat, we are AP Computer Science principals teachers. Oh, Fatima, thank you so much for jumping in as well. A part of BOCES, fantastic. And if you don't mind sharing a little bit, so you all have shared out who you are, what your role is. I'm curious, why are you exploring an alignment of computer science principles? Now, obviously, we'll talk about the state timeline, but what's it matter to you? Are you being requested to have an alignment by your department? Are you curious to make recommendations for courses? Are you looking to use the alignment as a motivation for getting more students in? I'd be curious your motivations. I'll jump in and talk a little bit about what I did and why that process was of interest to me. But a little bit about me. I am 17 years into the classroom. This is my 8th year of teaching computer science. I have taught for 6 of the 7 years that AP Computer Science Principles has existed for. I facilitate professional development for computer science principles teachers. Those who are interested in teaching it oftentimes go to a training for APCSP, and I do that training throughout the summer sometimes, usually in 2-week sessions. I have graded for what's referred to as AP Reader. I have beta tested back when they did their first rewrite. I actually beta tested the new curriculum that it's active, the new framework that we are actively teaching under. I'm a part of the CS4NY leadership team, which is part of why I wanted to share out what I've done and part of what motivated me to do this crosswalk that I'm going to share with you. I'm very interested in supporting schools and other teachers who are implementing these CS&DF learning standards. And I thought this was one way that I could use my experience and expertise to help lighten the load for my colleagues. Part of how I went about this process, I am on the National CSTA Standards Alignment Review Committee. We get curriculums from various providers, and CSTA wants to be able to evaluate that curriculum and say this aligns to the CSTA standards. So I've been through that training, and I do that with other curriculums as they come in, as they go to CSTA, they get passed to me in a committee, and we do that alignment. So I figured I'd take that same training, that same experience, and say, well, let me do that alignment to New York's standards. And so that's kind of where the processes that I followed came from. So as many of you are aware, we have the new state standards. They finished and got approved December of 2020. And we are now 3 years past that, almost 3 years past that. Sorry, yeah, 3 years past that. However, most noticeably this year, September 2023, that's us. If you notice, if you haven't seen this in the timeline, all credit-bearing computer science courses will be aligned with the New York State standards. So here we are this year, our courses, if they are credit-bearing computer science courses, are supposed to be aligned with the new standards. So what does that even look like? I've asked the state and said, what is an alignment? And they kind of just leave it at, you need to align your course. And so I simply took from my own experience and turned that into an alignment document to help you, my colleagues out, some of you here in the presentation, and also the many folks that I go around the state and chat with and try to help bring about implementation processes in their districts. So what does a curriculum standards alignment look like? New York State did not provide any guidance on this, so I had looked elsewhere and found what I consider to be kind of the gold standard, the best example I've seen of a curriculum alignment to a state standard. And I'll put this link in the chat here. Let me pull this up. And I'd love to have you take a look at this because I think this is a great example. This is from Massachusetts. They took 27 different K through 5 CS curricula, 18 6th through 8th grade CS curricula, and 15 different high school level CS curricula. And they did an alignment of those to the Massachusetts standards. And I think this is a fantastic document. So I'll just point out some of what they did here. This is done by an outside agency contracted by Massachusetts Department of Education, the agency's STEM learning design. There's a lot of details in here as to how they selected which curricula were being evaluated, what their metrics were. There's a lot of details in here because this can be a very charged issue because you're basically grading an entire company's product. And this is a state government agency saying, well, here's our evaluation of you. And so they provide a lot of detail as to how and why they rate it at what levels. But if you get on down deep enough in, you'll see some of the examples here. So page 17 is where you see the first summary of one of those evaluations. And you can see Massachusetts lists out their, what they call DL and CS, so their digital literacy and computer science topics. New York State and Massachusetts are very similar in that they combine those two areas in their standards. And you can see their own evaluation of does this curriculum align with Massachusetts digital literacy and computer science standards. And like I said, this is a 100+ page document because they've gone through and done many of these alignments. I do want to point out that this was done by an independent agency, mostly made up of classroom teachers. And they talk about that in the first 10 pages or so of that document. And I think that's a critical piece here, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Now, New York State, I've discussed this with them, and New York State has held true to their "we do not endorse curriculum" mantra. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. There's some politics involved in doing this. You are telling companies, you're grading companies, and that can get politically charged. New York State Ed does not want to alienate any potential curriculum developers, and the last thing they would want to do is scare them away from ever implementing anything aligned with New York State. And so New York takes a very neutral approach, and so they do not endorse. And currently, state ed considers an alignment like Massachusetts has as a form of endorsement of these curriculum. Now, that could be debated. That's their choice, but I'm just sharing out why you see that. Now, the other reason I wanted to share Massachusetts is because they included an additional metric that is not tied to their state standards. So I think this document I shared with you, I want to get this out because I think they did a fantastic job. And it's still applicable here in New York and all states because they also evaluate some of the classroom practices, the teacher support that's available. I like that they even look at how is the pedagogy within this curriculum represented? Is it culturally responsive? And they evaluate that. They look at what tech tools, what equipment would be necessary. Is this a portable curriculum? Is this web-based? Is this document-based? What is that? And so I think there's some metrics that we can even benefit from looking at Massachusetts' own evaluations as well. So sharing that out, I think that's a great resource for those who are looking at alignments that you might want to take a look at. Now, obviously, New York State had many requests for curriculum alignments, in particular in CSP. So New York State, trying to stay extremely neutral, will not and does not collate these. And so I started a community-based effort to collect some of the existing curriculum that are aligned to state standards. And I can share this link with you in the chat as well. Now, this is my personal collection, and I would love to hear and see any other alignments that you folks may be aware of. I'd love to promote those as well. I don't work for the state. I do not represent the state. And so this is an independent collection. So all I've done is, as I've found and seen these, I've listed them. So for instance, CMU's CS Academy, they list their alignments to the New York State Computer Science and Digital Fluency Standards, and you can see they've listed out the different concept areas and then how their curriculum aligns to that, which this one appeared to be a very short, brief alignment to that. But they vary drastically. In fact, what I want to do is jump over to one that I think they did an excellent job with, and that's CodeHS. Again, I'm not endorsing them, but I like the way they did their alignment. In particular, we'll take a look real quickly at the grade 7-8 band. CodeHS did a really neat job. They generically provide alignments to many different standards. So you can choose the standard framework that's being aligned to. In our case, we're going to look at the New York State 7-8 one, and then you can choose any of their courses, and they'll tell you how it aligns specifically to that. So if we were to look at the Intro to Computer Science in JavaScript, this then identifies our New York State 34 learning standards at the 7-8 level, and then it identifies the lessons that directly align with that New York State standard. And this is a pretty typical what I would expect to see in an alignment, what I would think an alignment should be. Here is the New York State standard, and here is the activity or lessons or material that teaches to that standard. And so you can see they've done that with the New York learning standards and this specific course. You can, of course, change to any other course. We could even jump to their computer science principles course and take a look at how that aligns. Now, it's not going to align real well because we're looking at the 7-8 learning standards. So I'm not surprised to see a low mapping here. In fact, that raises an interesting question that I wanted to ask folks is this is one potential curriculum that people can implement in their districts for the New York State 7-8 Computer Science and Digital Fluency Learning Standards. Would you consider this course aligned at 26%? Is that aligned? So I think it's a healthy question to ask because New York wants all credit bearing courses this year and going forward to be aligned to the New York State standards. So, what does alignment really mean? Does it need to cover 100%? Yeah, thank you, Susan. Doesn't seem very aligned. Yeah, but does that meet the requirement that it aligns to the standards? I don't know. I think that's for each district to decide because, all right, so this course maybe covers 26%, and maybe that course over there that we offer in science where they're doing some coding, that covers another 13%. And so I think realizing that not every one course needs to cover 100% of the standards, recognizing that the standards were intentionally written to be integratable into a variety of courses. We don't need to cover everything in one course. Now, that depends on your school's choice for implementing these standards. These standards, 100% of these standards should be a part of 100% of every graduate's curriculum. Every K1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, and 9, 12 students should be aligning to 100% of the standards at that level. Does one course need to cover them all? It depends on the district. And that's going to be important as we look at how CSP aligns. So if you do know of more, I would love to know of those and include them in the resources here to share with folks as they're looking for courses that are aligned to the state standards. But we're talking specifically about AP Computer Science principles. So let's dive a little bit deeper into CSP. I think there are a couple important characteristics I want to point out about computer science principles. In particular, this is at the high school level. AP courses are at the high school level. So we're going to be looking only at the 9 through 12 grade band. AP-CSP is a relatively new AP course. It started in 2017. There were 44,000 students nationwide that took the course in the first year, which, believe it or not, was more students taking it in the first year than in many other of the AP courses. So there is definitely interest in this course, and there's been record growth since then. The AP enrollment fluctuates throughout the years, but computer science principles is continuing on an upward trajectory. More and more students are taking this course, which I think makes sense why folks are interested in how does this address the New York State learning standards. In 2022, there were over 134,000 students who took it. In New York alone, there were over 10,000 students who took the exam. Last year's numbers from 2023 haven't yet been provided publicly, so I'll update this as it goes. And like we saw in the keynote earlier this morning, there was a dip in 2021, but we do see a continued growth. So this top pie chart is New York's enrollment in AP Computer Science principles. I'm very curious to see 23 and this year's, to see where that goes. How much of a blip or how much of a dip did the pandemic have on enrollment in CSP? Unfortunately, generally being an elective course, I think there's going to be quite a bit of a hit. I think we may see a bit of a plateau here for a couple of years until we get back up to steam. The last pie chart I put down here, this was in 2019. Each one of the slices of this pie are a different subject area that there's an AP course for. So for instance, the big blue pie chart is English language. That has 11% of all of the AP exams in 2019 were in that subject area, and so on. APCSP is this green pie slice down at the bottom at 6%. Now, 6% sounds like a small amount, but this is a significant slice in the overall AP pie. CSP may only be 7 years old, but it is no longer a niche subject area. Computer science principles in particular has a lot of folks engaging and teaching that. The other important thing to note here is that CSP has gone through 2 revisions. And so I want to be very clear that the alignment, the crosswalk that we're talking about today is on the currently existing framework. There was earlier stuff back in 2021. There was a big rewrite that rearranged the course. So this is about the current existing material. So CSP, my colleagues here in the presentation who are CSP teachers will recognize this big purple binder. This is the course and exam description. AP Computer Science Principles is a framework. It is not a curriculum. And I'm drawing that distinction because that's an important piece when it comes to talking about course alignments. You can't actually do an alignment to computer science principles because AP Computer Science Principles is only a course framework. But we can still benefit from this, and we'll talk about that. AP, the College Board, defines the disciplinary practices and learning objectives that any computer science principles should be achieving, but computer science principles framework does not dictate the classroom experiences that students are having to learn those objectives. So in many ways, the course exam and description is just another set of learning standards. So we really can't do an alignment between the two. There are 20 currently approved College Board implementations of AP Computer Science Principles. The alignment that I'm going to talk about, the crosswalk that I'm going to show you, is not for any one of those specifically. This is only and exclusively for the framework itself. So I did an alignment or a crosswalk, if we can call it that. This is a teacher-provided one, much like the Massachusetts ones. This is not done by the provider themselves. However, in late 2021, the College Board did eventually put together an alignment that they had. Though I'll be honest, I was a little embarrassed to read theirs. It felt like some of the alignment material that I was reading at the national level for the CSTA's curriculum, where they mostly did a Control F, find the word from the state standards and say, look for it in the framework and say, okay, they're aligned. I think there's a spectrum of alignment that needs to be addressed here, and I'll talk about that. However, doing an alignment to the framework was challenging because I needed to separate my own implementation of CSP from the framework itself. So what I do to teach the standards in the AP course may be different, may go above and beyond what's actually required by the framework. And so I'll try to show some examples of that here in just a minute. So what I'm really talking about here is a crosswalk between 2 different sets of standards. I probably should have called this a crosswalk between APCSP and New York State's CS&DF standards, because what I'm really doing is identifying equivalent outcomes from these 2 different standards documents. Now, because of that, that leads to a challenge, because how the College Board chose to divvy up and identify outcomes in computer science did not directly align with New York's. And I don't mean that in that there isn't overlap. but how they chose to divvy up or apportion the knowledge base of a computer scientist versus how New York did that didn't match. And so it ends up being how multiple objectives in CSP were necessary to say we found equivalency with New York's. And so there's not a direct one for most of the learning standards between these. There's a lot of similarity, but they get written differently from each other. Now, why do a crosswalk? Why not just jump into my specific curriculum? Well, for a couple reasons. One, the crosswalk will simplify the process of doing an actual alignment of CSP. If we know that courses have to align to the College Board's learning objectives, well, that means that if my course is meeting those objectives already, and I know some of those objectives meet New York's, I don't need to worry about the ones that I know have direct correlation. I only need to look at the ones that don't. So what we really are going to be doing here is I'm going to share with you what I think are the gaps that a CSP teacher needs to fill to complete an alignment. And I have exactly that document to share with you all. Any specific curriculum may already achieve the standards that my crosswalk is going to say CSP is deficient in. Let me get into some specific examples here. So in the alignment that I did, I took the individual concept areas, and you can see impacts of computing, computational thinking, networks and systems design, cybersecurity, digital literacy. I identified the grade 9 through 12 grade band only, because we're only looking at the high school level. And I evaluated whether I thought CSP's framework, not my implementation of the course, whether their framework will require and expect students to meet New York's standards. And so there's a summary table in the framework I'm going to provide you, which has the state standards and whether CSP aligns to it. Now, I want to highlight this is CSP meeting New York standards. That does not mean that if you have a course that meets New York standards that you can go the other direction. This only works one way. You can't take this and say, okay, well, I can now teach almost all of CSP because of how closely aligned they are. No, this simply means that if you teach what the College Board requires you, here's where you've met or are deficient in New York standards. So they don't go both directions, which initially was a struggle for me. I had to settle on which direction I wanted to go. However, before I jump past this summary table, I think is great proof as to why CSP is an excellent choice for implementing at the high school level when you're considering implementing the computer science and digital fluency standards. Because if you look at the vast number of green checks, now the green checks here mean fully aligned. I think if you meet the CSP, you've got these New York State standards covered. Only the red X's indicate gaps. The blue boxes here that have I for information, there are some details that you don't necessarily hit up, doesn't necessarily match up with New York's expectations. And I'll get more details going on that. So within the alignment, what I did, and I'm going to provide you this, is I took each of New York State standards. And to justify how I came up with that summarizing evaluation. So looking at one specific standard in the top left, you'll see this is talking about the impacts of computing at the 9-12 level. Standard number 2 is debate laws and regulations that impact the development and use of computing technologies and digital information. I consider this to be partially aligned, that CSP is partially aligned with New York standard, because if you look at computer science principles in the third box down, you'll see skill 5E is evaluate the use of computing based on legal factors. Impacts of computing in CSP talks about how students are expected to be able to explain how the use of computing can raise legal concerns. These sound very, very much in line with New York's debating regulations that impact the development of computing technologies. However, this is only partially aligned because if a student only meets the CSP requirements, they have not quite risen to New York's expectation that students can debate laws and regulations that impact computing technologies. So there's closely aligned, they're partially equivalent, but as I mentioned below, the AP framework does not expect students to defend or critique a law or regulation. So, going back to the summary here, the blues mean they're really close. Some of them very, very close, but don't necessarily rise to what New York State is expecting in that same area. So, looking at the summary again, perhaps you see there is a lot of alignment here. In the crosswalk that I provide, I also summarized these are the 5 standards that have no equivalent alignment in CSP to New York's learning outcomes. Now, it should come as no surprise, for instance, in the digital literacy standards, APCSP talks nothing about proficiency on the keyboard with touch typing. But New York State, because we brought in the digital fluency learning outcomes as well, that's a part of these standards that CSP doesn't even address. Similarly, transferring knowledge of technology in order to use new and emerging technologies on multiple platforms. If you read New York's clarifying statement, that's talking about having a digital fluency that can keep up with current new technologies. This may be stuff that our CSP students are developing, but is not a measured required outcome of APCSP. So this is not, there's no equivalent expectation in the framework for that. So only 5 complete gaps that don't have direct alignment. There are a bunch of partially aligned, which now that you look at it individually, this doesn't look nearly as big of a list. CSP is really close. There's a lot of similarity. So why am I highlighting these? Because this creates the opportunity for teachers, for my colleagues to say, okay, I have to do an alignment for my district, no problem. Here are the things that I've got to meet. I've got to fill in the gaps here. I've got to address the closely related topics, and perhaps my course already does. So let me share with you the entire document that I have here. This is the detailed alignment, and you can see all the gory details involved. And I'll give you a few minutes to take a look at that. So for those of you who joined from earlier on, while folks are looking through, this was my own personal, as an educator, as an experienced computer science principles teacher, this was my evaluation of the framework. Those of you in the room who are also CSP teachers may say, hey, I meet these things. Great, because your actual implementation may be different from what the actual college board expects to be in your classroom. So what do you notice in here? What do you wonder about? What's missing? So if you follow the link, it'll open up to this. Here's my explanation of the process that I did to come up with this alignment. you'll see what I consider to be my levels of alignment: completely equivalent outcomes, partially equivalent outcomes, and no equivalent outcomes. There's the summary table that I showed. And then you get into, starting on page 4, you'll see my standard by standard evaluation, looking at New York standard, and then where in the computer science principles framework do those match up? Where are they related to each other? And is there an equivalent alignment here? Does a student who meets the minimum AP computer science principles framework requirements, does that also meet New York's computer science and digital fluency standards? Fatima, thank you. You like how digital literacy is defined. Can you elaborate on where? Is that in the New York State standards? Ah, yes. Okay, great. Yeah, I really appreciate New York's clarifying statements. So the top portion of each of these standard by standard reviews are right out of New York's computer science and digital fluency learning standards. So you can see the standard identifier, the contents of the specific standard, and then below it, the clarifying statement are also from New York's CS&DF standards. And I really appreciate that New York included the clarifying statements in their standards to kind of elaborate and help detail some of the thought that the 100+ contributors were trying to share in that, what often tends to be a very packed single statement. And you'll see in each of these, if I did not give it the big old green check, I justified why I said that. Yeah, excellent, Jessica. Thank you for mentioning that. So this is leads in a little bit to where I wanted to go next with this, is just to take a look at some of these specific examples. So looking here, I'm on page 4, at the bottom of page 4, if you'd like to look on your screen, looking at the impacts of computing for New York State standards. The standards simply debate issues of ethics related to real-world computing technologies. In APCSP, as Jessica's pointing out, APCSP used to have students do an explore task, which they had to write about how different issues affected real-world computing technologies. I would say, though, Jessica, that even the explore task would not have met, if it stayed as the original version was, would not have met New York's expectation. And part of that is, during the review process, looking at New York standards and looking at the College Board's course framework, if you look at the specific verb used in the standard, debate issues of ethics. And I think that's important. If we consider Bloom's taxonomy here, debate is not just a can you do it? Debate is much more involved than that. You need to make a stance and be able to defend it. You don't have to necessarily defend it successfully, but you need to understand the counter positions that may exist. So using the New York State choosing to use the word debate issues of ethics meant that there was a much higher bar than what the College Board lays out in their framework. Yes, in the College Board framework, students are expected to evaluate the use of computing based on ethical factors. Yes, in APCSP, Students are expected to explain how computing can raise ethical concerns, but that doesn't yet achieve New York's expectation that students can debate these issues. Now, that may seem like I'm nitpicking and splitting hairs here, but it's also helpful, and during the review process while I was doing this, to not only look at the 9 through 12 standard, but even go back. And in fact, at the 7-8 level, these expectations at CSP align very well with what we're expecting our middle school to do. And so I think it's really important that we do split hairs over a word like debate when that is supposed to represent in New York State the growth that a high schooler has who has been learning these standards all the way from kindergarten on up and progressively growing in their understanding and use of computer science and digital fluency. So, no, I don't think I don't think it's splitting hairs. I think looking at the verbs are a really important piece because Bloom's taxonomy would clearly tell us there's a difference. Excellent, June. I'm so glad you mentioned that. Many of the endorsed CSP courses likely engage students in debating these issues. And that is exactly what I want to get to. So I'm going to scroll on down here to the end where we can once again see here is where I identified this was one of those standards that's close but doesn't quite get there. This is just a summarizing table of it. But in the end, I put in a document here in the appendix. Here is that learning standard. Where was that? Impacts of Computing 3, debate issues. In my class, if we're going to have students able to evaluate a computing technology, considering the ethics involved, what better way than to have a class debate about it? So, absolutely, I think many of the actual courses and the actual curriculums, again, because this is a framework, not a curriculum that we're doing here, many of the actual learning experiences may address that deficiency. So, yes, in my classroom, we debate the issues of ethics related to real world computing technology. So, in my classroom, even though my own evaluation of the framework said that this was a deficiency in my classroom, because my actual implemented curriculum involves debating, check, got that. And so I don't want you to leave here saying, oh, there are a whole bunch of deficiency. Dave pointed out that all of these are close, but they don't quite meet it. What I want to instead point you to is take a look at how close they are. And in an actual classroom, or as June pointed out here, in many of the curriculums, it would feel natural to get into debating as a fun classroom engagement piece. And so, in many ways, this is not a wow, there are lots of deficiencies. This crosswalk here is meant to be for a teacher to take and say, okay, well, to meet New York standards, I have to do this. Hey, I'm already doing that. And what this does is this lifts a burden off to say, you don't need to take the time to find how your CSP curriculum aligns with New York's impacts of computing standard number 1, because it already does. If you meet the CSP framework, you've got that unit covered. You're good. You really only need to look at the ones here that are potential deficiencies. And so this summary table, and more importantly, the very last page here is the, hey, here's what I know I need to look for because it's not in the framework. How am I going to measure that in my students? What is my assessment method? And then, okay, what is the teaching and learning activity that I do that can meet that? The cool thing is, and I hope my colleagues who also teach us will look at this and say, gosh, a lot of those would be really easy to add this little bit in, and I can mark that as we're good. So with our 15 minutes left, what I thought would be good to do is to jump back to the summary table and let's just consider some of these. I hate to keep using the term deficiencies. Let's look at some of the places where there is not a direct alignment, where there is not a direct correlation between the standards. And you'll notice that it's only one or two in each of the concept areas. We're only talking about five um, gaps in the alignment that would need to be addressed. And I'd also like to take a look at, and I'd encourage you afterwards to take look at this much more closely and say, Dave, I disagree. I think the framework really does push students to this or to that. And I would love to receive feedback on that. This was one of the issues I had with New York State stepping back and saying, nope, we're going to stay neutral on this and let the providers write their alignments. I would suggest, and I can say from experience, that many of the providers would have looked at some of these and said, yep, we're good. We address ethics, check. And I think that does a disservice to our students because the standards that New York State wrote were very intentional, vetted by hundreds of folks across the state. This was the level that the stakeholders in New York State set as the goal for all students. And if we can just say, well, the provider says we're good, I think we're doing ourselves a disservice and we're definitely doing our students a disservice here. So I'd encourage you to look more closely at the standards. So if you're doing an alignment yourself of your course, look closely at the verbs involved, look closely at the specific details that are involved as well, because you may have related topics, but New York State has said this matters, include this as well. So I'd love to jump into computational thinking. We are in a computer science education summit, and so I thought that'd be a good place to start, in particular because computational thinking already starts off with a gap, which I think is one of my favorite areas that CSP doesn't cover that New York does. And I know in my implementation of computer science principles, we do cover this standard, but the framework for CSP does not expect that. So I wanted to jump over to CST, Computational Thinking 1, and take a look. So New York standard is create a simple digital model that makes predictions of outcomes. And my colleagues here who teach CSP may recognize that there really is no required creating of a model in computer science principles. There is modeling and simulation in APCSP. There's a discussion of some of the limitations of models and simulations. There's a lot of content about that, but absolutely no expectation from the computer science principles framework that students will create a computational model. Certainly not what New York State defines as a model that makes predictions of outcomes. I think this is an important gap in particular as we're looking at all of the AI models that are being discussed in the media. We need to be much more aggressive with our students experiencing and considering what it's like to create computational models. Yeah, you can tell them, oh, the training set that you use is really important. But until they actually try that and create the model, will they really walk away knowing how critical the bias in the training selection is? Now, does it have to be machine learning of that sort? Not necessarily. There can be digital models of the effects of gravity on the movement of a cannonball, right? That can also be a digital model. So this doesn't have to be machine learning, but we do need to talk about how models choose what things get left off, what things get included. And until students have to create their own, I think we're missing that. And so this is the one area in computational thinking that I think APCSP doesn't get close to. Similarly, data in CSP gets talked about a lot, but New York State actually wanted students to get out there and collect and evaluate data. Now, in my class, this is real easy because as we're talking about data and many of the projects, I have students collecting data from various databases. Um, this is not a requirement of students at the CSP in the CSP framework. Students are not expected to collect data for their use, and use of multiple sources of data is not a requirement in CSP. So there are some small gaps. It's related. You should hear how similar these are, and it would be easy to include this, but it will require you to go back and look at, okay, when I'm covering these topics in my CSP course, do I step up to the New York State standards, or do I just stop as the curriculum provider had to? Do I just stop at that lower level? Similarly, refining and visualizing complex data sets to tell different stories with the same data set. New York wants our students to understand that a data set, the conclusions we draw, the narrative that comes out of that, can be viewed very differently with different lenses. And so New York State wants our students to actually go through and look at telling different stories from a similar data set. Absolutely. Yeah. So the methodology that's used will cause a different narrative to come out. But we want our students to be able to not only say, yeah, okay, I recognize that, right? We're not low Bloom's taxonomy. We actually want to push our students to be able to create different stories with the same single data set. And so I put this in as partially equivalent. Students for CSP do need to use data to come up with conclusions, but can they draw multiple conclusions from a same single data set? And so for that reason, I I think it's close. In my class, I push them to do that because I think that's important. New York State thinks that's important. And in CSP, it fits right in. It's the next day. We just finished what the curriculum providers said to do. So the next day, we just go the one step further, and now we've met that expectation. So I would consider the New York State standards also aspirational for those of us teaching CSP to say, well, what did New York State want to push students further on? The other one here is modifying a function or procedure in a program to perform its computation in a different way over the same inputs while preserving the result of the overall program. Yes, in AP Computer Science Principles, students do indeed need to create functions and procedures with various parameters. Absolutely, that's expected of students. However, New York State wants them to go one step further and actually modify a function so that it can do it a different way. They want to be able to perform the same computation in a different way, still getting the same output for the same inputs. Again, I think New York did a great job here of really pushing and saying, no, 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 it's not good enough to just make functions. We want students to recognize that there are multiple ways of doing this, and we're going to expect them to, at the least once, do it themselves, find another way of implementing an algorithm. So I hope this gave you a little bit of a taste for the detailed work that's involved in doing an alignment like this. I hope those of you, my colleagues who are here, um, see this as a resource. If you have to do an alignment with your CSP curriculum, that you can use this document to speed that process along. Know that you don't have to do the entire course curriculum, but be very detailed in the verbiage. And does New York State push them a little further? Also use this as an inspiration for what else you can do with your students, and hopefully recognize that you may have already achieved many of these that the framework doesn't expect. Um, in these last 5 minutes, I'd love to just stop here and see if there are any other further questions about that. You've got access to what to the alignment, or crosswalk as I call it, that I wrote up. I would love to receive feedback on that. If you teach the course yourself and have thoughts or disagreements, please do share. I am not perfect, and I read this every time, and I'm like, maybe. So I'd love to hear your feedback on it. Yes, Susan, absolutely. That's such a great way to finish it up. It doesn't seem too bad to add the lessons to meet these standards. Absolutely. And I'm going to celebrate that even more in saying I haven't seen any other course as widespread as CSP is that very easily can just add another lesson or two and meet these standards. I think CSP is a fantastic example of a course that should be promoted around New York because it does cover so many and so easily can cover all of the standards. And you're absolutely right, because the AP exam is in mid-May. You could fill in some of these gaps afterwards. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you for coming and participating. I appreciate the feedback. I appreciate your eyes looking at these as well, and considering what's an alignment look like. Bonnie, that's a great question. Um, code.org. Yeah, there are a lot of others. So the initial list that I provided, that I've collected of alignments, um, does not include code.org. That's this website here. I did some of these alignments myself. I had colleagues from other districts who are using some of these, and they did the alignments themselves. It seems silly for 10 teachers in New York who are all teaching the same course to each have to do their own alignment, which is what motivated me to start collecting these and sharing these with folks. So that if you're teaching one of these courses, why on earth would you have to do an alignment? So I personally do not teach code.org. I would be glad to do an alignment with someone, but I feel somewhat ill equipped to dive into a curriculum that I don't know real well to evaluate. And so I would love to partner with someone who does teach a code.org course, and I'd be glad to collaborate on an alignment with them. No, it doesn't have to be nearly as detailed as I did for CSP. Um, and you can see some of the other more general alignments in those examples. So if you yourself or you know someone who would be interested in doing that alignment, I'd be glad to partner with them. My email address is, I'll put my email address in the chat here. So please, by all means, reach out. If you have other questions, if you have feedback, what do you like? What didn't you like? What do you disagree with? Those I actually like best, because it gives me a chance to reconsider the decisions that I made. Fatima, you're very welcome for the Google Doc. Hopefully the other resources are of use as well. Thank you, Bonnie. I appreciate that. And thank you for coming and contributing. Jessica, thank you. So wonderful to be in the same space with you again. We'll have to connect again at some point. Oh, Susan, that's great. Yeah. And like I said, Code HS, I think they are certainly did the most exhaustive alignment with their materials. However, I will say I think there's more alignment than they're necessarily leading on to. So I think you may find more. June, I would love to include BJC on the list if you yourself or you know someone who would like to collaborate with me on that, or if you know if an alignment's already been done, I would be glad to include that on the list as well. Absolutely. Please do reach out if that's a possibility, if there's any way I can help, because I know BJC is common in New York.